Hello ladies and gentlemen, today we're back in War Thunder and it's time to talk about a vehicle which I feel has its rightful place in the game. Over the last few years we've got a lot of love for the British bomber line, whether it be the Sterling, the Halifax, the Lincoln, which unfortunately doesn't have its right bomb load, but at least it's there. Stuff like the Hampton, even the Sunderlands. We've had a lot of these big British bombers which have been added to the game, which were used historically, but there are definitely a few which are still missing. One of these is of course the Manchester. The Manchester being a bomber very similar to something like a Lancaster. Maybe it's seen as a bit too close to it, but I still think it should make its way into the game. One of them, which is different to the rest in a significant way, is of course the Armstrong Whitworth Whitley. Now, the Armstrong Whitworth Whitley was a pencil bomber by all regards. It was able to be used up to 1942 and even produced up to 1943 when it was a late 30s bomber. Now obviously there was a lot of competition in World War II for the British bombers, whether it be the Halifax or the Lancaster or any of them, which were used to a great amount, but the Whitley was one of the first to be used in not just an offensive role, but also a passive role of trying to give leaflets to people in countries which were being overtaken by the Germans to try and make sure that they wouldn't fall to their rule. So, continuing the tradition of ugly but robust and reliable heavy bombers, the British Armstrong Whitworth Whitley, it was a heavy bomber which was used from the early years of the war up and through to 1942. It was obviously an unappealing design, being a pencil bomber, which was phased out very quickly when we look at the Germans, or when we look even at any country. There was just better options which were created at the time, but it was still a heavy hitter, and was able to do a lot of damage to the German war machine because of its reliability and also the bomb load it could carry. It was obviously obsolete by the war's mid-years because the B-17s came along for the British, the Lancasters, the Halifax, all of these wonderful machines which just outclassed it in every way and were just better than it in every way. But you could say the same about something like a Hampton, so therefore, in my opinion, it should be in the game. The Whitley, even though it was outclassed by 1942, 1943, it was still able to fulfill its projected role it was designed for, and gave the RAF an offensive punch when they were on the ropes. The Whitley began as a derivative of the AW-23 transport bomber design. The first prototype of the Whitley flew in 1936, so this is definitely a mid-1930s aircraft. The operational models of it would follow by 1937, so against the traditional tradition of many British aircraft, it actually got out of the doors pretty quick, with two versions, the Mark II and the Mark I. These were split between an initial order of 80 aircraft, 34 for the Mark I and 46 respectively, and there were minor differences between the two, but the main difference was the fact that they used different engines or power plants. The Tiger 9 radial engines were on the Mark I, and the Tiger 8 radial engines were on the Mark II. The Mark I would pretty much be removed from service in its entirety by the time 1939 rolled about, so pretty much when the aggression started in Europe. The Mark III, though, would appear shortly after in an initial batch which introduced the ventral gun position that was also retractable. The Mark IV would come along with differing radial power plants in the form of Rolls-Royce engines, and a subvariant of the Mark IV would appear with a newly configured power tail turret which housed the quad 7.7mm machine guns. The definitive bomber variant of the Whitley series would have to wait until the appearance of the Mark V model, to which the system would take on the brunt of high-level, deep-striking bombing missions in enemy-held territory. So this was one of the early heavy bombers, or, in quotes, heavy bombers that the British had, which were able to go after German industry at a time when those concepts were not really even thought about, because of obviously the advancing Germans coming towards you. Maybe it wouldn't be the best idea to knock out their production, maybe it would be better to focus on the advance, but still, it was a job which had to be done, and therefore the Whitley was able to do it. Now, since it has many variants of it, you could see it very much similar to the Wellingtons that we have in-game. There are many Wellington variants with very slight differences, and the Whitleys have much larger differences than those Wellingtons in themselves, all of them pretty much having different engines and having different armaments, meaning that you could at least easily put 3 or 4 of these variants in-game and it would work completely fine. So the Armstrong Whitworth Whitley was designed on a basic twin-engine aircraft idea with a heavy bomber classification. One of the most identifiable features of the series lay in the interesting angled down format of the nose and cockpit section. This in itself contained a very obvious protruding chin feature, which you may see on the front of the machine. The crew accommodations amounted to 5 personnel, which were positioned in various parts of the aircraft. They were either manning systems or defensive weaponry. The standard armament of the Mark V model, which is probably the one that I would advocate the most for, consisted of a single 7.7mm machine gun in the nose, and also it had, which was in a gunner position, so it wasn't a stationary one, and it also had 4 7.7mm machine guns in a powered turret assembly on the tail of the plane. So it had a pretty good defensive armament, especially if we're talking about a BR-122 vehicle. And the addition of this Nash and Thompson product offered up the removal of a retractable ventral gun position seen in earlier models. So the powered turret was a big step forward, especially for British bombers. We see that with the Wellington, with the Lancaster, with the Halifax. It made a massive difference, which was, a big difference to the defensive side of the aircraft, even though a lot of the time they obviously flew at night. Internal bomb load was also limited to 7,000 pounds, which is still a decent amount, especially when we talk about a Rank 1 aircraft, and this would definitely be a Rank 1 aircraft. Also, the Whitleys, though becoming obviously outperformed and vulnerable to all of the improving enemy attack aircraft at the day or the night of the time, plodded along as required in the frontline operational capacity up until the early to mid-1942, even though the production continued up until 1943, weirdly, which is normally the production stops before they were put out of service, but it's one of those weird abnormalities. In the end, the Whitley would be replaced by the next generation of British and American-made bombers, so pretty much the Halifaxes, the Lancasters, and also the B-17s, and they were designed to take on more in the way of long-range heavy strikes, so more bombs, and also they had better defensive capabilities in mind. I mean, when we look at a lot of the British vehicles, maybe you could say that there isn't a ton of defensive capabilities, at least compared to something like a B-17, but it's definitely more than what the Whitley had, which is what we're discussing. And even though it was phased out by the time of the mid-war, it's still remembered, at least by a lot of people, me, myself included, as one of those workhorses which should be represented in a game like War Thunder. The Mark V version, which started in 1937, there was 1,656 of them made. So there is a lot of these which were made, meaning that they have a rightful place in the game. We are not talking about a paper aircraft or a prototype aircraft. This was one which was used on the front lines in an aggressive capacity. Obviously, with the 5 crew, the weight when it was full of bombs and ammunition and everything was quite heavy at 15,196 kilos, or 33,501 pounds, and the engines, which actually had a lot of power behind them, surprisingly. The two Rolls-Royce Merlin XV12 piston engines developed 1,145 horsepower each, so that totals 2,290 horsepower, were able to get to 370 kilometers per hour or 230 miles per hour at their maximum speed, and it was able to go 1,500 miles or 2,415 kilometers. The service ceiling was not very high at 26,000 feet or 8,000 meters approximately, and the rate of climb, well, 286 meters per minute is not great, and actually got itself into a lot of trouble, especially over the North Sea. But once again, it had the 17.7mm in the nose turret, the 4 7.7s in the tail turret, and also up to 7,000 pounds of bombs. So that definitely means that this would fit perfectly at rank 1 in the British tree, at least when we compare it to some of the other vehicles that have been added. I mean, I have been a critic of these lower-end bombers, which have a lot of payload and can't really be stopped because nothing is able to, climb to them. But still, if we're going to go along this route of heavier bombers at lower tiers, the Whitley should be represented. Now, one of the main reasons why I love this aircraft, and why I've talked about it many times on the channel, is because of the fact that it is present in many pilots and many bomber crews' memoirs, basically being the old bird that you don't really want to touch, but sometimes you have to go for. One of these is in the book Yorkshire Airfields in the Second World War. It is by Patrick Otter, and I would highly recommend it. So you can pick it up from Amazon at a very, very decent price. If you want to pick it up from I believe I got it from a charity shop, and it was about £6, so about $10. But the retail price is £12.99, which is about $15 or $16. So if you're interested, or maybe about $20 actually, if you're interested in airfields in the Second World War, especially bomber airfields, which the majority in Yorkshire were, I would say pick it up, because it's a really good read and goes through every single airfield that was based in the Yorkshire area, and talks about the squadrons, has, excerpts from pilots and commanders who were actually on the bases, and they talk about all of the bombers that they flew, why they liked them, why they didn't like them, and also some of the fighters, because obviously the Germans didn't just attack from France, they also attacked from Scandinavia, and were able to bomb ports such as Hull and further inland, doing quite a lot of damage to the shipping and also some of the production in the north of England, which is a part of the war which is kind of forgotten about, which is very sad. But anyway, one of the excerpts is talking from a bomber crew where they're pretty much left with this one Whitley, and they are mainly using Halifaxes and Lancasters at the time, being 1942, and when your Halifax or Lancaster was up for repairs or struggling in some way, they were left to have to pilot the Whitleys. And basically, instead of you just taking the day off, you got a different aircraft, which at the time was in the form of a Whitley. So this one crew took a Whitley bomber, and it was known to have a few issues with its underpowered engines. And first of all, they dropped out of formation, because obviously they couldn't keep up with the 4-engine beasts, and they couldn't actually get above the cloud layer by the time that they left Yorkshire and got to Norway, which, if you know anything about, geography, the North Sea is not exactly the smallest area, and they weren't able to get to the cloud cover, and what was happening was the engines kept freezing over because they weren't turning over quickly enough. And so what they had to do was, because they couldn't get above the cloud layer, they were open to AA fire. So they just had to turn around and go home, because this Whitley was so useless compared to the other machines that the Royal Air Force were using, or Bomber Command were using at the time. And there are many stories like that in this book, and it made me really appreciate the stuff that the bomber crews had to go through before they had these wonderful machines in the form of the Lancaster and the Halifax. But if we look at just raw numbers, the defensive armaments on the Whitley with the 4 7.7s, it's very defensive from the back. That's very much good enough for rank 1. The 1 7.7 looking forward means that it isn't as aggressive as something like a Hampton, which I like. I don't think it should be. And then up to 7,000 pounds of bombs held internally. This may be seen as a bit too much bomb load, but the thing is, the Hampton already has a very large bomb load, and so does the Wellington. Even though the Wellington, I believe, no, it can carry more than 4,000 pounds. It can carry the Cookie, but it can carry like something like a crazy amount of 250s or a crazy amount of 500s. And as we've seen with a lot of British bombers in the game already, they don't have their proper bomb loads. A lot of them don't, or at least they don't have their maximum bomb loads which they could carry. So you could fiddle it if they really felt like it. If they felt like the way to get it into the game is to fiddle the numbers that you could carry with the bomber, then they could do that as well if it was for balancing purposes. Because obviously the Whitley with 7,000 pounds of bombs held within it, let's just say it struggled to get off the ground, or at least from character testimonies in the form of the bomber pilots, they said it really struggled with anything that was over 5,000 pounds. So yeah, that is the argument for the Whitley bomber. I would love to see it in the next few updates. The only real other thing which could be added to the game from the British bomber point of view that I'm looking forward to is the Manchester. But the Manchester will probably follow a very similar role to the Lancaster. And I'm completely fine with that. I enjoy flying all of the British bombers, but I feel like the Whitley should be put in the game first just because of its historical significance. But anyway, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.